Well, thank you everyone for showing up for this virtual downtown dialogue. I am honored to have these amazing guests on our panel today. And the theme, the topic is sharing our stories, modes of healing for combat veterans. And we really want to lean in on some of the ways that people coming back from combat, coming back from war, ways that they, one, tell their stories, but also how that storytelling process can become a healing process for them. So I have some illustrious guests. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about them. Sue VerHoef is the director of oral history and genealogy at the Atlanta History Center. John Butler, the board chair of the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association, and Dr. Henry, oh God, Bayerle. Bayerle, I got it. Associate Professor of Classics at Oxford College, Emory University. Thank y'all for taking some time on a Sunday to talk about this subject. So there's a section at the end of the play where the poet starts to list all the wars and conflicts in recorded history. And it's probably one of the most, for me, watching it as a viewer, one of the most impactful moments in the play. From your vantage point, from your individual work, and I would like each of you to address this. Could you talk about how our attitudes as a culture have changed regarding both the impact of war on soldiers returning and the need to address those issues as well? Whoever wants to start is welcome.
I'll jump in, Addae. Although I had a little different perspective, I think, on the moment that you mentioned in the film, because what struck me about it was two things. Number one, that we really have never been without war. I mean, this has been something that has been going on constantly. And I think about my lifetime. I'm an old lady at this point, and there really hasn't been a time in my lifetime when we have not been in some form of conflict someplace in the world. But the thing that has struck me more recently is that the percentage of the American population that have a direct connection to warriors, to those who are serving active duty, I don't think has ever been this small. We did a little live streaming Veterans Day program at the History Center last year, and based on the statistics that I was looking at, it's very, very small. We've really never had a time in this country when there's been such a big disconnect between the vast majority of the population and those who are actively serving. So those were kind of the two things that popped up when that moment occurred for me.
Yeah,
I think that's an important thing to recognize. If I quote statistics, I'll probably be imprecise, but I think I'm relatively accurate. The difference being, roughly, I think it's about 10% of the, used to be, when I served in Vietnam, about 10% of men at the time were in the military. And now it's 1 or less. So it's about a tenth as many. And even in World War II, even though everybody was involved in the war in one way or the other, the actual population who served was a similar percentage. I think that is a factor that that impacts the general population's connection to and understanding of what it's like to go to war. The other thing is, frankly, nobody really that has not actually been shot at knows what that's like. You just can't imagine it. You can get some understanding of it. So recognizing that you can have understanding and you can have sympathy and you can have an open mind to hear, which is important. But you really can't say, I know what you feel, I know what you're saying. You can't really have the empathy similar to a police officer. I had a very nice conversation the other day with a guy who had served with the police and sheriff's office. And there's a lot more similarity between what we experienced than sometimes another soldier who didn't actually serve in harm's way. I think everyone, and Sue and I think we're in violent agreement about this. Everybody who signs the blank check, as they say, to give up to and including their life on behalf of, to protect the country, that's a significant thing that you do when you do that. And then, I didn't choose to be in combat. That's just what I was assigned to do. But my brother, who was 5 years older than I, who also signed the same blank check, ended up serving in the States the whole 2 years he was on active duty. But he's no less of a soldier than I am. So I'm rambling, sorry.
No, that's perfect.
Well, I'm just, again, going to agree with John and Sue. I'll go take it way back to ancient Greece, because I assume that's why I was invited here. And as a classicist, I could go on at length about the differences and the similarities. I can talk about some of the differences, although I think that in many ways they're less important than the similarities. Absolutely, as John and Sue mentioned, I mean, it wasn't 10%, right? In ancient Athens, it was virtually 100% of the citizens. Athens was more or less constantly at war. Even Socrates, who in Plato's Republic envisages a perfect city, which is going to have the best possible life for everybody, he says, we'll need an army because there will be war. So it was just taken for granted. Some scholars feel that because the soldiers who fought in ancient Greece were perhaps more accustomed to killing, saw more death and violence, and because they did not have the Judeo-Christian taboos against killing, and because in Athens and several other cities, killing and dying for the state was very highly esteemed, and they had the support and were rewarded by their societies. So some people feel that for this reason, the experience of war would have been less traumatic for soldiers in ancient Greece. And I don't want to get into debates about terms. Did they have PTSD in ancient Greece or not? I think that, and as Homer's Iliad shows, and as was beautifully conveyed in your performance of an Iliad, trauma did exist in war in ancient Greece. These soldiers felt trauma. Achilles experienced trauma, the trauma of loss, seeing someone, a comrade he loved, the closest person to him, his comrade in arms, die, led to trauma. And that trauma caused Achilles to go over the top. So when people tell me, well, weren't the Greeks and Romans more accustomed to killing? I say, well, every society, whatever time, whatever place, there may be differences, but every society has lines that you do not cross. Agamemnon crossed that line for Achilles, and Achilles then crossed that line in his treatment of the body of Hector. And we see suffering, we see trauma, we see how it impacts families, how husbands, fathers, sons are lost. So yes, there was trauma in ancient Greece. I'm going on a lot. I don't want to turn this into a lecture, but suffice it to say, some scholars believe that not only Homeric epic, but also Athenian tragedy had a very important function of allowing citizens, allowing an audience of veterans, because remember, Greek literature was written by veterans for veterans. And a lot of scholars believe that the act of telling these stories had a function of communal healing. But I'll leave it at that for now. Happy to go into detail.
Oh no, because you're going to talk again, and and you're speaking our language, talking about the importance that drama had in Greek culture, especially. This idea of going back to Aristotle, Aristotle's Poetics and catharsis. The fact that the communities needed this sort of horror, and they needed to witness the horror in order to heal and to recover from it. So you're speaking our language there. And I have another question connected to that. There's a term, moral injury, which Sue introduced me to because I'd never heard of it before. And this also happens to be, Doctor, your field of study. Could you talk a little bit about what moral injury is and how that sort of intersects with your scholarship in the classics, but also how that's represented in the play itself?
So moral injury, people have spoken about various kinds of emotional responses to moral outrages for centuries, but at least in the field of psychology, the term has become popular really since the work of Jonathan Shay in the 1990s. So Jonathan Shay was a psychiatrist who worked at the VA, actually a VA clinic in Boston, and he had this idea that Homer's Iliad actually could help us understand the experiences of the Vietnam vets whom he was treating as a psychiatrist who had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. So he wrote this book, Achilles in Vietnam, and for me, in my life, I actually started graduate school in Boston shortly after he published that book. And one of my professors, Gregory Naj, actually was the classicist whom Shay had worked closely with and who actually encouraged Jonathan Shay to publish that book, which ended up winning him a MacArthur Genius Award. So Shay defines moral injury as the betrayal of what's right by a person who is in a legitimate position of authority in a high stakes situation. And he looked at Homer's Iliad to really to understand what this is about. And according to him, and I agree, Achilles is offended in this way by Agamemnon. And I always tell students, if you think that, okay, some guy went and burnt down a town, killed half of its inhabitants, kidnapped a 15-year-old girl, and then complains when she's taken away, if you don't feel sorry for him, well, we agree about that. I mean, you know, I hope you consider that to be a war crime. But here's the thing. In Homeric culture, this idea of a war prize is everything. And I love Jonathan Shay's analogy. He says, really, what Agamemnon did to Achilles would really be the equivalent of an officer in wartime telling a soldier who won the Congressional Medal of Honor, I'm going to take that medal away from you because I don't have one. And it's not right for me, your commanding officer, to go without this award when you have one. It's outrageous. It's something that everybody would just consider. It's like, yeah, to somebody who doesn't know anything about this, it's just, so what? It's just an award. What's the big deal? But anybody who's part of this culture who understands what a Congressional Medal of Honor means would say this is nuts. And if this happens, then what matters? And so, according to Jonathan Shay, it's this violation of what is right. And I like, and I like it. It may seem somewhat vague, just talking about what's right, but I like it because it brings out the fact that it is somewhat relative. It's what the society values. And according to Shay, this brings out the mainness. And I love hearing the ancient Greek in your production. The mainness, the first word of Homer's Iliad, wrath. And it's not just wrath, it's a supernatural anger. It's the type of anger that humans don't normally feel. It's this overarching anger. And according to Shay, this is what, by being put into this situation, by being violated morally in this way, Achilles is more susceptible to reacting to the death of his closest comrade in a way that is destructive and violent, and ends up destroying Achilles himself. And again, we have to clarify here. Killing on the battlefield in Homeric poetry is not a problem. It's never called wrong. In many cases, it's considered tragic, and the losses are sad. But nobody blames people for killing in the Iliad. it's what Achilles does, the way in which he does it, and how he treats Hector's body. So that's Shea's thesis, and I find it certainly very useful in helping to understand Homeric poetry. So having sort of been raised from my earliest studies with this idea, when I came to Georgia, I thought I would do sort of the reverse of what Shea did, rather than trying to use ancient epic to understand modern psychological conditions. I'm not, after all, a psychiatrist. I thought, well, why don't I have my students talk to local veterans to help them better understand ancient poetry? So it's sort of the reverse of what he was doing, and that's because you know, as much as I lament the civil-military divide in our country, the fact that people talk all about war without really understanding what the experience is, I'm still happy that very few of our soldiers have had to fight in combat. I think over my 14 years, I've only had 2 students, both Israeli citizens, who had any experience in combat. So having students talk to veterans, I started that as a way of helping them understand really what the literature of ancient Greece and Rome meant to its original audience. And I've been delighted with the results. You can always tell, you know, I'm sure when you're on a stage, you know when you've got the audience. You can always tell as a teacher when the students actually care. So I've been doing this now for over 10 years. I decided to expand this project by applying for an NEH grant to set up groups of veterans and also some non-veterans to try to read through some of this ancient poetry and just talk about the experience of war. And one of my goals, as I said, was to sort of try to get across this civil-military gap, but also just to help people understand. As I said before, I don't argue politics. I mean, I do in certain contexts, but not in my professional life. You know, whatever you think about all the wars we're involved with, if you don't know, if you haven't talked to someone who's been there, maybe that should be your first step.
And perfect segue to someone that I know and respect, who talks to a lot of veterans. So you come from a military family. A lot of your work and your scholarship as an oral historian centers the narratives of veterans. Could you talk a little bit about, since you've been doing this work, the changes or the transformation in doing this oral historical work with veterans, the things that you've witnessed from these participants, and also the ways that it's impacted you as well?
Yeah, I'd love to. You may have to shut me up though, because I can talk about this forever and a day. I started working with the Veterans History Project back in 2012, and I'm a Navy wife, Air Force daughter, Army granddaughter, a lot of military in my background, and have always had an interest in military history. So the Veterans History Project at the Atlanta History Center, which is the collection that I manage, is a collection of about 800 oral histories that we have collected since 1995. The impetus for beginning the collecting was an exhibit that the History Center was doing on World War II in Georgia, not only from a veteran's perspective, but from the home front. So what was Atlanta like in World War II? What was it like to be here in Atlanta in World War II? And that went hand in glove with early efforts on the part of the Library of Congress to begin collecting veterans' oral histories. So you may know in 2000, Congress voted funding for the Library of Congress to preserve and maintain these stories. And of course, the Library of Congress can't do this nationwide thing on their own, so they reached out across the country for partners. And the Atlanta History Center was a founding partner in that effort, even though we had already been collecting. And the impetus for that effort, I think, to be honest, was kind of Saving Private Ryan. This realization that came about along about that time period when that film came out, that we were losing World War II veterans quickly, and that when we lost them, their stories were going with them. So the focus because of the exhibit the History Center was doing, and then the early days of the Library of Congress project, the focus kind of was on World War II veterans. And it was this sense that, you know, we need to provide these men and women with an opportunity to share what that experience was like, you know, before they're gone. So these are people that are talking about their wartime experience 45, 50, you know, 55 years after the fact, which as an oral historian can present problems. You know, memory is a funny thing. The way that we construct memory and the way that we desire to share memory can be very different. So that was kind of the really early days of the project, and we collected probably about 500 interviews before I took over the project. And then we sort of noticed a shift in focus to our Vietnam veterans. And a large part of that was, prior to my taking on this project, there was quite a long period of time at the History Center where there was no staff member that was monitoring any of this. The only reason why the project didn't end up dying on the vine was because we had a small, highly motivated, highly dedicated group of volunteer interviewers that were all Atlanta Vietnam Veteran Business Association members. And the leadership of that organization was very deliberate about encouraging their members to be interviewed. And there's a million reasons for that, and I'll just kind of gloss over a couple of them. I think one of the big ones was many Vietnam veterans very rightly feel that they were never permitted to tell their story when they came home. The media told it for them. And part of that is, you know, the negative things that we all associate with that time period. And our collection is filled with stories of Marines, you know, getting off the plane in San Francisco and having feces thrown at them. You know, all of those kinds of stories about what went on during the Vietnam War and immediately after the Vietnam War. But then the flip side of that was, you hear this over and over again in the interviews that we do. Nobody cared. You had two sides, two ends of the spectrum, and nothing in the middle. So you had, you know, folks that came into some of the bigger cities who got some of that really negative attention, but then you had garden variety folks that went home to Nebraska or Georgia or, you know, Tennessee or wherever, and nobody cared. Nobody wanted to hear about it. You hear that over and over again. My family didn't want to hear about it. You know, I kind of, you know, and then of course there was that popular misconception driven by a lot of what came out of Hollywood and what came out of the media, that Vietnam veterans were someone to be feared, that they were unstable people, and that, you know, if you said the wrong thing, you know, all kinds of things would happen. So many of them took great care to hide the fact that they had come back from Vietnam and to make sure that that was kind of put on a shelf. So now, 50 years after the end of the Vietnam War, now there's a more of a, and John of course can talk much more eloquently than I can about this, but there's much more of a feeling that I've seen among Vietnam veterans that they really want to be able to tell their story, and they want to be able to tell their story the way they want to tell it. They don't want to be directed. They, you know, they know what they want to say, and they want to say it the way that they want to say it. My difficulty has been, and again, I'm getting older and older with every passing minute here, that we're losing our World War II veterans, we're losing our Korean War veterans, now we're beginning to lose our Vietnam veterans. And I'm finding it terribly difficult to plug into, in any kind of a meaningful fashion, to plug into the global war on terror veterans. We have a small, very compelling, amazing collection of interviews of folks who served in Desert Storm, Persian Gulf, Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation, the other ones escape my memory, but we'll just say under the umbrella of global war on terror. They're wonderful interviews. But I think the reasons, I'm sure there's lots of reasons. My instincts are the reasons for that are, these are men and women who are busy, they're in school, they're raising families, and they're not viewing what they're doing as history because they're still living it, which is another whole piece of the global war on terror, that this has been going on for decades now. And that's never happened before either. You had World War II folks who signed up for the length of World War II. You had Vietnam, which was typically 12, 13 months, depending on whether you were Marine Corps or Army. You got a lot of folks that did multiple tours, but that was a very limited, tended to be a limited experience. And now you've got folks who have been to Iraq and Afghanistan over and over and over and over again, multiple deployments. And so that's just very different. So just to sort of wrap all this up, because I'm sorry, I'm afraid I'm waxing eloquent here too. The interviews are amazing. Many times we'll have a veteran at the end of the interview. Very often they'll say, geez, I said things that I've never said before. I remember interviewing a World War II veteran. His wife was sitting in the background. We interviewed him at his home. We do that quite frequently for older veterans. And at the end, as we were wrapping up our equipment, shutting the camera down, she said, I've waited 80 years to hear that. He had never shared any of that with her. She had no idea what he had done. We hear that same kind of thing from other family members. It's the most rewarding thing I've ever done. Don't tell anybody, but I would do it for free. If I could afford to do it for free, I would do it for free. There is nothing like, and I've had this experience very recently. For Memorial Day this year, we selected a small clip from a United States Navy chaplain who was served with the Marine Corps helicopter unit in Iraq. And he talks during the interview about losing one of those Marines. It wasn't even in combat. It had been a relatively safe deployment. And John, when you talked about signing that check, regardless of whether you serve in combat or not, this young man had volunteered to stay behind to handle the ordnance for the unit. And then he was going to catch up with the unit. They were literally days from going home. Got into a helicopter with another group of folks, and apparently the pilot lost situational awareness. I don't know if it was bad weather. He thought he was accelerating up. It turned out he was accelerating down. The aircraft crashed and killed everyone on board. And so here was this Marine, a safe deployment, and a freak accident takes his life anyway. We put that clip up on our social media channels, and I was hoping that his family would find it. And they did. So the family of the Marine who was killed found that little clip, and the feelings that they expressed about hearing someone else talk about their loved one is just so powerful. And as a genealogist, that's a big thing for me too. I would give anything to be able to talk to someone who served with my uncle who was killed during World War II. Those are really powerful moments. But the last thing that I just kind of wanted to point out is there are many folks that are still not ready. We can't get Vietnam nurses to come in and talk. We have two women who served in the Army Nurse Corps in Vietnam, and they're the only two that we have in a collection of 800 interviews. They just don't want to talk about it. And there are many folks who still feel that way. So our job is, as best as we can, to make this opportunity, to make people aware of this opportunity. And we're ready when they're ready, however long that may take. And the other thing that we try to do, we can't quantify it, but we feel strongly that it's true. Having a veteran on the other side of the camera, we feel makes a big difference. I have 8 volunteer interviewers, 7 of them are combat veterans. And I just have this sense that creates a little bit of a safe place, because men and women know that there really isn't anything that they can say in terms of their experience that's going to be shocking. Does that answer your question a little bit, Addae? Did I go too long? Sorry.
Oh no, you answered all the questions. No, that's great. That's great. That's great. And it's interesting too, because I'm thinking about the challenges that even we had trying to get in contact with organizations that deal with veterans from the war on terror, and it's really difficult. And I think it's because, like you said, Sue, I think it's because it's ongoing. I'm thinking about the part in the play where the poet gets to those wars, and you just keep hearing Afghanistan repeated and repeated and repeated, and it's just like, oh my God, that these things have been going on in that region of the world for years now, and this is still not over. So, yeah. John, you do a lot of work with veterans groups, with the AVVBA and other organizations. Could you talk a little bit about some of the challenges the really specific challenges that these veterans have coming back. And as a country, have we gotten better or gotten worse with helping these soldiers deal with these challenges once they get back home?
Well, that's a lot right there to talk about. First of all, I commend Sue. Sue knows that I'm one of her biggest fans, and she got a lot of fans. She does a tremendous job, and really respect and appreciate all she does. And I'm one of those that when did the interview process at the Atlanta History Center with Sue, there were things that came up. There was a combat veteran who was interviewing me, and that helped. And there were some things I talked about then I never talked about before, and it was cathartic. Let me just say, for background a little bit, when I went to Vietnam, I was prepared to the extent that anyone can be prepared. I knew that I would see some really rough things. I would see people wounded and killed, and I just knew that. And so to the extent that you can ever be really ready for that, I think I was as ready as anybody could be. I was not prepared for the rejection and the acrimony when I came home, and I just didn't know how to process that. And fortunately, the country as a whole, I think we have learned, and by the way, that's another thing that we've learned, the military has learned from, is that when I went to Vietnam, I was by myself. And when I came home, I was by myself. And I was one of those, I flew into San Francisco, not a great place to come into during Vietnam. I had a very significant encounter with a young mother as I was coming through the airport. I'll never forget it. So my point is that I think when my nephew, who served in Afghanistan, when he came home, he was on a plane with his whole unit, and we welcomed him home. And I think we've learned enough to say, that's important, that you have to decompress. You got to spend some time with your buddies, with your guys you've served with, just so you can share the experience and transition from being in the middle of a combat zone to being at a Kroger or whatever it's going to be. And then the other thing is that we have, as a country, have grown significantly in is, even if we all agree, or half of us agree, or whatever, even if we think war is bad, and or that we shouldn't have been in any particular war or another, we don't blame the warrior. We don't blame the person that went to fight. And has fortunately has come around significantly since Vietnam. One of the things that's changed also, and I experienced this when I was on the board and actually on staff for a while as a fill-in executive director at the Veterans Empowerment Organization, where a lot of our veterans were homeless, and then we brought them into an environment where they could establish a base of operation where they could actually then begin to grow into becoming self-sufficient again. There are different reasons people join the military, and one of the things that I have seen lately, that I don't know that it happened as much in the past, is men and women. Now there's a lot more women that join and serve than when I was in the military. Join because there's some great benefits of doing it. Financial, potential of schooling. There's some significant benefits. When I was in, it was not a lucrative process. It's just something you basically, it was my duty to do. But the point is, some of these people have brought into the military and then carried through the military, and then when they were discharged, they still have unhealthy issues about the way they were raised. About some of them have been abused as children, and they never got cared for. They didn't have the resources to have that dealt with. And then in the military, some of that was exacerbated because they related authority to abuse. And so when they get out, they're really messed up and have a hard time recovering from that. And a lot of them fall through the cracks and never get the treatment they need to come over to get over that. So I'd have to say, I don't know if that was the case before, because I think maybe Henry, or I think he's the one that mentioned this, talking about in the ancient Greeks, did they have PTSD? Probably. They didn't call it that, they called it something else. But now at least there's some recognition. This lady has suffered from something, and while they were in the military, it either made it worse or it came to being, and they need help. And in the past, I don't think we even had an acknowledgement. We didn't even think about it. We didn't acknowledge it. It's just like, poor guy, poor person, they're messed up, and don't know how to help them. So, and back to what Sue said earlier, there is something about a veteran talking to a fellow veteran that is, it's not that it can't be done by a non-veteran. I know a young lady who is a counselor who is very effective. She does a very effective job of helping veterans, but she's trained to do that. And I know a lot of people that want to help open dialogue with a veteran that's struggling. And frankly, just to be heard, and especially to be heard and understood, goes a long way toward helping that person then begin to get a grip on what they're dealing with. But I think it's important to know it's time to call in a resource that can really help that person beyond just making that initial connection. So for example, United Military Care is a nonprofit in Marietta I've connected with just in the last 6 months or so. Does a really good job of dealing with veterans that are in a crisis mode. And again, what they're able to do is to, usually with a veteran, another veteran connects with them, establishes enough of a relationship that that person can trust being directed to a resource that they'll actually help. I hope I'm not rambling too much. At one point, my cousin, who's also a Vietnam vet, I found out later that my mom had actually asked Phil to try to help me because she thought there was something wrong with me. She was wrong, of course, and that thing wrong with me. But he finally convinced me to go to the VA and register for the Agent Orange exposure. I actually lived in the jungle for almost the whole year I was there. There was no break from that. And so I had a lot of Agent Orange exposure. And in one of the processes that was, I went to see a psychiatrist. Well, I didn't relate to her at all. And she did help me discover some things that helped me relationally with, like my son, had a very dysfunctional relationship with my son, which is mostly my fault at the time. But I didn't want to go back. So my point here is the biggest issue, if I could say, if there's all these scattered conversations I'm having, is the veterans to some level know they're not quite right, but they don't know what to do about it. And it's very hard for them to hear from anybody except another veteran, typically, that there is something you can, this is something you can get help with. You need to let that happen and go get that. So that's a lot of confusion, I'm sure, but I have no idea if I even answered your question. So
you definitely did. You definitely did. And I want to open this up to the folks in the room. You have any questions for any of our esteemed guests? Would love to hear them if you do.
Addae, can I say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I have a question. I actually, came of age during the Vietnam War and had guys who lived on my block who went, some of whom came home and some of whom didn't. And I remember once having a conversation with a guy, which sounds very much like a lot of the stuff you've described, of me asking him questions and him being, it was like, there was no way he was answering me. It was just like, he just You know, he just couldn't talk about it. But he was so closed off because of that experience that actually, you know, it did lead to problems in the relationship. So when I saw this topic today, I was really very interested in hearing what you people had to say about this. And of course, I've now lost the thread of what my question really was, but basically, I did want to know, of the Vietnam veterans, I think you did touch on this in the beginning, they are included in your group and they are in fact getting help from other veterans as well, who may have, you know, who maybe not shared that experience, but shared the experience of being in another war. Is that happening? I guess this question is for Sue.
Yes, ma'am. Actually, I was thinking maybe it was maybe a question more for John.
Right.
So, yeah, John, why don't you kind of field that? Because I think you've got more experience with particularly Vietnam vets. I can make a few observations about global war and terror veterans and the help that they get. But what do you think about Vietnam veterans and getting help?
Well, something that actually Henry said earlier, and I don't remember what it was now, clicked with me on something. The members of the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association are all guys. Like, there's a few women, but mostly it's men, because at the time that's the nature of the beast. Came home and regardless of how they served, and led a productive professional life. So by definition, these are guys who do not believe, at least, they need any help. But one of the things that really has been so helpful to me, and I recognize that now that I have been through some leadership roles there, I encourage our other veterans to do this. There are veterans, and I was one of them, that just didn't acknowledge the fact that we have unresolved issues. And the most successful treatment of that is actually to reach out to another veteran, whether they're Vietnam or not, and provide some kind of tangible help to that person. We have Veterans Court, we have volunteers that do that. There's a variety of ways we serve individually, our members do, and all of those people are younger in the way they act. They're more healthy, they're more positive. It's almost a tangible benefit to do that. Then again, with the VEO and other organizations I've been involved in, it is helpful if you have a veteran that's experiencing the same conflict that is helping someone that's struggling, but it is not nearly as important as having someone that will that can draw the person into a conversation, because the person, the veteran who's speaking to that other veteran, has some basis of basic understanding of what they've been through, and they can drop their guard, they can relax enough, they know that you get it, even if it's not the same experience. They know that there's a similarity of spirit, whatever.
Thank you.
And if I can just piggyback on that really quickly, I just didn't want to let this opportunity get away. I'm staggered all the time by the volunteer work that our Vietnam veterans do. And this is not just AVVBA members, although I'm told that there's almost a fight over who gets to work down at the USO at the airport. They're so determined to make sure that these global war on terror veterans come home to the welcome that they never got. They're so bore-sided on that. But we interviewed a fella up and coming who had some type of a job during the Vietnam War with military police. He donates his time to the local sheriff's department to work with missing and exploited children. I interviewed a guy down in Griffin who was a combat assault helicopter pilot. He donates his helicopter pilot expertise to their sheriff's department to do. And I see this over and over and over again. These men and women came, for whatever reason, they came back from Vietnam, and oh my gosh, talk about giving to the community. They do amazing things. John mentioned just briefly the pro bono legal stuff. But, you know, and I've reached out to a few fellows at AVVBA before, you know, I've got this person who's got this problem. There's always somebody willing to help. I'm just always amazed, and I'm not sure why that is or how that came to be, but the give back that all of these men and women have done in their communities and their local communities over and over and over again is just phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
It's self-serving because it really helps us.
Yeah. Jessica, I saw your hand up.
So I had a question for Henry. You said at the opening of this, maybe before we're actually on camera, that you've read the Iliad 20 plus times, and I've read it. My one and only time of ever reading the Iliad is more than 30 years ago. And I was wondering if, when you saw the show, if there was anything that you heard or saw that you thought, well, that didn't really happen in the Iliad, or was it really a very good recitation of the Iliad?
Okay, look, I mean, classicists will always pick on the little details. I think, I mean, when people want to debate about how accurate any portrayal of the ancient world was, I always start with, well, they didn't speak English. I mean, so, I mean, something's always lost in translation. I think this is the best representation of what the Iliad means that I've ever seen. Sure, the Iliad does not contain all the details of the Trojan War. You know, the tragic death of Addae happens after the end of the Iliad, the baby, Hector's baby child, who is killed in the destruction of Troy. I would say also that probably for the Greeks, I think they were maybe a little bit more into, I think for them, the Iliad was in some ways like an action movie. I think they did find some of the gory parts of war to be maybe exciting, but also the glory. I think that they saw it as something glorious. But to me, showing the cost of war, I think for me, the most moving part of the entire performance, where I think Leo Osorio did a wonderful job, was when he took that blanket and cradled it like a baby. And that comes straight from book 6 of the Iliad, when Hector comes in, he's covered with blood, but he has to come in because he wants to get the people of Troy to pray to the gods, because they believe that praying to the gods would help them. And he sees his wife and his helmet. His wife is so happy to see him, relieved to see him. He's so happy to see her and his baby. But when the baby, Addae, sees the giant helmet on his head, he starts to cry. And so this is really, here you see the world of war and the impact of war on families. You can see that war and families, they collide here. And it's a beautiful image in the Iliad. And I thought Leo Osorio and the writers of the play did a wonderful job. So absolutely, I really think that if you want to read the Iliad, then what you need to do is read the Iliad. But the way the Iliad was experienced in ancient Greece, by the way, also was closer to theater. It wasn't theater in the strictest sense of the tragedies and comedies that were put on in Athens, but it was a public recitation. That's how they experienced it. So in some ways, actually, seeing a one-man show on a stage is actually closer to the experience of the Iliad in ancient Greece than sitting down and reading it for a college class.
Mm.
So Doc, I want to warn you, this is being recorded, and so it may show up in marketing materials. I will not be held responsible if it does. Stephen, you had a question.
Thanks, Addae. You know, I wondered, thinking about World War II, I think most people, obviously, we're the victors, so we might be accused of thinking this way, but I still think even in hindsight, most people feel it was like a righteous war. It was a crusade against evil. In our later wars, they've become increasingly ambiguous with questions about what are we doing there? And are we really accomplishing anything? And are we, you know, in certain ways, any better than the people we're fighting?
So have you all in the veterans world, do you see differences in the way the veterans talk about their experience from the so-called righteous war to the later wars where it's more ambiguous? Is that a thing that kind of creates more doubt or more anxiety?
I'm guessing I should answer that. The similarity between World War II and Vietnam is that it was expected and it was required that you serve. The difference, one of the biggest differences, is it was obvious to everybody in America what we were fighting and who we were fighting against and why we were fighting in World War II. It was not obvious to pretty much anybody in America, and certainly not even to the soldiers who fought in Vietnam, why we were there. We knew we were fighting against communism and the spread of communism. And it was really years after Vietnam that I began to fully understand there really was some significant value of having fought and served and against, basically fought against communism in a part of the world that would have become almost certainly highly communistic, and we stopped the spread of that, even though we abandoned our allies by Congress refusing to fulfill the promise that we made to the South Vietnamese to continue to provide them supplies and air power. And since the North Vietnamese were being supplied by the Russians and the Chinese, they didn't have a chance. But they lasted 2 years before they finally were overwhelmed by it. But that's a side point. I think to your point, though, it has become more and more ambiguous. The situation with Afghanistan is even more difficult because, at least in Vietnam, South Vietnam was a sovereign country with leadership in place. Afghanistan, even though it's a country that you can see the boundaries of and on a map, was really a collection of tribal leaders, very little structured government in place to build on. So I'm not a historian and I'm not an expert in Middle Eastern affairs, but it's pretty seen to me, it's pretty common knowledge that it was very confusing what we hoped to gain, and did what we hoped to gain make any sense? Was it even possible? Which I think it was not. And then, of course, pulling out and leaving our allies completely defenseless was a horrific mistake. But nevertheless, I think if I'm not answering your question, if I can get back to
I really wanted to know, does it change the way the veterans feel about their combat experience when they felt they were doing it in a righteous crusade as opposed to an ambiguous war?
That's a good question. And I think we struggle more to feel good about it, but when we're involved in it, we are there. When we are involved in war, we are protecting the guy on either side of us. We are there. We are so focused on that, we don't think about the political implications. When we come home, it's, at least for me, and I think for others, my nephew was one of them who just got back from Afghanistan a few years ago, and struggled for about a year or so to get his feet back on the ground. You do now want to know, was it worth the sacrifice? Not only that I made, but even more so what I saw people every day around me making the ultimate sacrifice. Was it worth it? And it's very difficult. It's not clear. Not as clear as World War II by any stretch.
Thank you.
Rob.
Thanks very much. This is absolutely fascinating. I attended also, I haven't seen the play yet. I'm going with my colleague Joanna from Arish Theatre. We're going on Thursday to see it, and I can't wait. I attended the Emory production of Ajax at the reading, The Theatre of War. It's maybe a decade ago. Some of you may remember that. Henry, I'm sure you do. My question is that where we go to Sophocles and Homer and Euripides, Trojan Women, those kinds of plays for a really empathetic sort of understanding of war, what's the place, John or Sue, do you think, for comedy in a response to, you know, this kind of question that we're talking about today? I quickly looked up Aristophanic comedy. You know, Aristophanes has the Acharnians and the Lysistrata, which are great satires and very funny. And we also think of, you know, MASH as a great comedic response to the Korean War. Is there anything in ancient drama, Henry, that you think really ought to be presented in a similar kind of way by Matt and Theatrical Outfit and the great practitioners in the city?
Well, you know, absolutely. I think comedy can create a space to talk about some very important issues, very serious issues, in different ways. You can, I feel that I do actually sympathize with Brian Dory's reading of Aristotle's Poetics when he talks about, very briefly talks about what catharsis means and what Aristotle is talking about and working through these feelings of fear and pity. But I think that in the case of Aristophanes and comedies like the Lysistrata, it actually creates a space where it's sometimes easier to question political programs and political goals and really talk about like who's benefiting from these. So I mean, you know, I'm a classicist. I support any performance of ancient drama, and in particular comedies that raise issues of war. I think that it'd be a wonderful way to start these types of conversations.
And John and Sue, do you feel that you're looking for response from comedy as much as from, you know, Homer and the tragedians?
Well, all I can tell you is that humor is, I think, in many ways an essential component. I think, and you know, MASH, you mentioned the movie MASH, not the TV series, that was about a different war, but the movie MASH, I mean, that was certainly a way for those folks to process the horrors that were going on. You know, it's gallows humor. It's something I think that many of us use, and we do see it over and over. I'm currently putting together new interpretive panels for our Veterans Park at the History Center, and one of the quotes that I chose was from a B-17 pilot in World War II who talked about his guns jamming in the middle of a fight with a German fighter, and at the same time his guns jammed, his electrical suit shorted out in his groin, and he was on the radio telling the pilot, "I'm on fire, I'm on fire," and the pilot came back and said, "Shut up and keep shooting." So he kind of started giggling in the interview, and he said, "So I shut up and kept shooting." You know, and whether or not he recognized that as a humorous moment when he was in the plane, probably not. But I do think that we use humor a lot to sort of recognize the absurdity, the inherent absurdity of so much that goes on. And of course, I'm not a combat vet. I can't, John, you're absolutely right. Unless you've experienced it, you just can't. But I can tell you that in the 800 interviews that we've done, there's a lot of humor there. It's a way to, I think, to keep your humanity in those kinds of situations. Does that help?
Well, I have really maintained and probably developed more and more of a sense of humor since that experience, because it's an integral part of, I think, being healthy and managing some of the memories and challenges. I mean, when I was serving in a armored cavalry unit, and when we knew we were going into a difficult situation, somebody in our group would sing on the radio, "You're going home in a body bag, doo-dah, doo-dah." I mean, it was just, like you said, it was that gallows humor. And you just kind of thought, you know, shit, let's go ahead and get this done. And it was helpful. My concern, the only concern I would have about the humor aspect, is it would be important to make sure that it was, I don't know how to put it, it would be recognizing the absurdity, but not denigrating with humor. Be careful that the humor was not at the expense of someone who that's the only thing I would say. Otherwise, I do think humor is a very powerful tool to help you relax and accept information. I believe in that very strongly. So if that helps your answer.
And it's so interesting that you asked that question, Rob. I'm thinking about American stand-up comedy because I'm obsessed with it. And the greatest comedians came out of the Vietnam era. Whether it's George Carlin, Lenny Bruce, Richard Pryor, like the greatest comedians came out of that era. So I think there's something there. Any other questions? Tom.
Addae, thank you for curating such an incredible discussion, and to all the speakers, I'm so grateful. It's just been so rich and meaningful. Here's my question. When I was in my 20s, I read Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, and he posited in that book that the greatest challenge facing humankind is if we can evolve from warring tribes to a global community. And that book and that thought has just been something that has stayed with me throughout my life. And I was so impacted in the experience of the production of An Iliad, I could hardly move. And now hearing this discussion, you three people have such tremendous experience with this aspect of the human condition. I would like to know from the three of you on this question: Are we making progress? Are we evolving from warring tribes to a global community, or are we not? Or is it impossible to say? Whatever thoughts or feelings you might have about that, I would really value hearing what you might have to say.
Well, I'll leap in there. Henry, do you want to go? You unmuted. Would you like to start? No?
Oh, no, after you.
Maybe this is just a pandemic thing, but I don't have a whole lot of hope right now. And I'm sorry to say that. The one thing that really struck me, one of the things that really struck me about this beautiful play that we're talking about was the references to anger and this and we see it all around us. I see it on my commute into work. People tend to go from 0 to, I'm going to get out of my car and shoot you in 0 flat. There's so much anger in the world today, and I feel like it's increased. And again, maybe it's a pandemic thing. Maybe as the pandemic begins to slide into our rearview mirrors, we'll calm down a little bit. But I find myself saying all the time, you need to start drinking decaf, because I just feel like we are wound so stinking tightly that I don't see a whole lot of hope for a more global resolution to our problems. I think we're too angry to sit down and listen to each other. And how you can turn a public health issue into a political divide. How does that even happen? I've talked to my kids, all the election cycles that I've been through in my adult life. It was always, yeah, I voted for somebody different. You're idiots in the office now. That's okay. When your idiot's done in 4 years, I'll get somebody I like, and you move on and you go and you raise your family and you do your things. And geez, we've just gotten so cranky. So I'm sorry. I wish it wasn't that way, but that's all I can say.
Well, I'm afraid I'm more or less on the same page with Sue and with Socrates, for that matter, about my doubts in humankind's ability to get together. But I'm thinking back to the earlier questions and what John was saying about World War II and differences. And the world is complex. It's a lot easier to understand why we need to get rid of someone like Adolf Hitler. Hopefully that's not something that anyone's going to debate about. But I also think about what makes me at least hopeful in some small areas, not about getting rid of war, but in small areas of our society. What John was talking about, the difference between the isolation that he felt coming home from Vietnam and efforts that people are making right now to welcome back veterans from combat. And to get back to the stuff that I've been working on, my research, when people talk about moral injury, there's some debate about what it is. But one thing I see across all these stories that people define as a moral injury is the sense on the part of the person who feels the injury that they didn't have my back. When you're doing something difficult, whether it be fighting for our country, whether it's fighting for something you believe in, or whether it's just fighting because you believe that you signed this blank check and let the politicians worry about the details for now, or whether you're fighting a pandemic as a healthcare worker, when you feel that they don't have your back, whether it's your boss, my commanding officer does not have my back, my country does not have my back, the politicians don't have my back. That's what creates this resentment and anger and lack of trust. So, rather than saying that I'm optimistic that things are getting better, I tend to think things have gotten a little bit worse during my adulthood. I rather would focus on what can we do? How can we cross these divides? How can we make everyone feel, I may not agree with you, but I respect you as a person and I have your back.
Yeah, I remember when that was the reality. I'm astonished, as you both said, specifically Sue, I'm astonished at how divided we have become about every single aspect. And we were talking about before we had Betty got online here, how emotional people are about whatever position they happen to take about the virus. They get so invested, they're so right about this little tidbit of should you wear a mask, and if it is, should be an N95 or not. And if you don't, you're irresponsible and an idiot, or whatever it might be. So that's a cultural thing that I don't know why it's so bad and what it could be done to change it. Back to, I guess it was Tom Key's question about it overall politically, war-wise. I hope we can finally learn that America is a unique country. We are not going to transpose onto a country like Afghanistan. They're not going to become America. There's nothing we can do. There's no amount of money we can spend to make Afghanistan a democracy with the same kind of a value system that we have in America. It's not going to happen. So don't try to make that happen. If you have when 9/11 happened and we were attacked, I will tell you from a human nature perspective, if whoever was the president at the time didn't do something tangible to respond, we would have crucified him. We would have been so mad he didn't do anything. Do something, even if it's wrong. I mean, I got to tell you, I think most of us felt that way. Whether it was the right thing to do or the right place to do it, you could question that all day long. But we should, even if we had to make some kind of a strategic or a tactical really response, we should not have invested. We should not invest for years and years and years into a campaign that requires men and women dying. That's not feasible. It is not going to happen. It can't possibly happen. We could not have, the idea of implementing democracy in Afghanistan is absurd. And we've been there 20 years, spent $1 trillion, who knows how much money. So it's possible. I don't see anything happening to make that, I don't see any indications. It's happening, but this would be a great time for us as a country to decide before we engage in another war and it'll probably happen, we will. A, is it really achievable? Whatever it is we're going to achieve, what are we going to achieve, and how? And that's the extent of it. And then we don't continue to live there forever. Our goals need to be realistic, reasonable, or we don't need to be doing it. So I don't know if that means anything to what you ask or not, but that's what frustrates me the most, is we are investing our brightest and best in this, in our country. And these are people calling the shots that don't have a clue what the goal is, how they will know when they're finished. They can't communicate that because they don't even know. Now I'm on a soapbox, sorry.
Thank you all very much. That's very, very helpful. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Any other questions? I just want to tell the three of you, thank you so much for this rich conversation. I can't wait till it gets uploaded so I can watch it again, just to listen to you guys talk. Thank you so much. And thank all of you for being here. Yeah.
Thanks for putting up with my tirade. I shouldn't have done that, I guess.
No, man. No, it's beautiful. Awesome.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, Addae.